So thank you everybody for joining us today. It's delightful to see this group, and I know many of you on this call, and this is our second session of a four-part memorial for Bernie Glassman, and we will have our third session a week from today, next Friday. And this will be focused more on interfaith, Bernie and interfaith activity. And then the final session will be on November 4th, which I believe is the day that Bernie passed 4 years ago. So please plan to join us. And so we're going to go ahead and begin. We have a wonderful group of guests today to speak to us, but we're going to begin with a short archival piece of film that Hoden's going to run for us. I believe it's 10 minutes or less. So let's sit tight, and then we'll get into our program. Thank you.
If you make a vow to end homelessness, or a vow to make the best cheesecake, all you have to do is do it.
Bernie Glassman is an American success story with a twist. With interests in manufacturing, distribution, real estate, construction, and politics, he's a mini tycoon. He's also a Buddhist monk who's taken a vow of poverty. It's one man's recipe for life. 1 part baking, 1 part building, 1 part Buddhism. The world of Bernie Glassman, Bernie the monk.
The teachings of Zen is to be at ease with who you really are. Use the ingredients that are available. Just as when we cook, if we look at what the ingredients are, it then becomes our job to take those ingredients and make the best meal possible. Not to complain what you have and don't have, but figure out how to use them in the best way.
Bernie talks in Zen metaphors like that, but to put it in the Western vernacular, he practices what he preaches. Here in the Greyston Bakery in Yonkers, New York, he oversees the making of some of the best cakes and tarts around. Mixes, no shortcuts. At Greyston, they bake the old-fashioned way, from scratch, with the richest ingredients and the noblest intentions.
I wanted to bring back the old art of baking and to create jobs.
Well, mostly to create jobs for Bernie's Zen community and especially for the unemployed of Yonkers.
As the bakery grew, we got to a place where we saw some light. We saw that the bakery was now starting to support our community. I felt it was time to get more heavily involved in social action.
You are not a man of contemplation, you are a man of action.
Well, hopefully I'm also a man of contemplation, but I'm from Brooklyn.
Bernie left the aerospace industry in 1976 to devote himself to Buddhism. In a few years, he was made an abbot. He became the leader of New York's Zen community, and it was in Yonkers that he found his mission.
Equal rights! Housing now! Equal rights! Housing now!
I looked around that area and felt that the biggest problem was the homeless situation. Now, Westchester, one of the richest counties in the country, has the highest per capita homeless rate in the country. So we looked at the whole situation and said, okay, we think this is deplorable, and let's do something about it.
In a twist on Robin Hood, Bernie bakes for the rich to feed the poor, or rather so the poor can feed themselves. The profits provide housing for the homeless and jobs for the unemployed. What's homelessness to do with pastries by now should be obvious. Making a cake 1 step at a time is like ending poverty, 1 life at a time. Almost 200 people have been trained at Greyston, and many have gone on to other jobs in the food industry. And Bernie's Zen management philosophy with incentive bonuses for teamwork means more cakes.
The idea that it's not possible for business to make a profit and solve social problems at the same time is false.
Ben Cohen is the socially conscious co-founder of Ben & Jerry's ice cream.
We're finding that we can have the biggest effect on social problems by working through business, because business is such a powerful force in the society.
Cohen hired Greyston Bakery to make the brownies for their chocolate fudge brownie ice cream.
Just by deliberately and consciously sourcing our brownies from him, we would be helping these social problems that he's working on.
Greyston Family Inn, permanent housing for 18 homeless families. They're renovating a vacant building. Of course, he had to create the Greyston Construction Company to do some of the work, because that meant more jobs and training for minorities in the area. Bernie gives people a chance, but which people? Only those also willing to help themselves.
This building will be occupied by families who have shown that they are interested in getting out of the welfare system and out of the benefit mode of life. We start getting indoctrinated into just being given things. Or then we can even get to the place where we expect to be given things. And we expect that that's the way the world's going to work. And it doesn't. We have to make our steps. So our first buildings are going to be occupied by families who make the steps. And we will encourage the step making, but we will not do the walking for the families.
There are 85 homeless families who want one of the 18 apartments. These women are among the hopeful. Mary Bird is a 35-year-old grandmother.
I couldn't seem to make it when I was trying out there, okay? So now I'm homeless. We just, hopefully Greyston will be finished by 1991. I'll be able to pay my own Con-Ed bill, pay my own rent, go buy me some food with some cash money, and not no food stamps.
The majority of the homeless families are single-parent families, women with children. So in order for them to go through job training, you need childcare. So I said, okay, let's create childcare centers. The first building has a daycare center for 44 children and has a little cafe. The cafe will have entertainment. The cafe will also be jointly run by us and the school system as a training site for retail clerks.
It is a joy to report that the first of those families will move into the Greyston Family Inn next month, and that Bernie already is negotiating to buy the building next door to house some more.
Okay, well, let's move into our program, and once again, thank you all for being here, and thank you to our wonderful guests. I'm going to hand the microphone, as it were, to our friend Chuck Lief. Many of you know Chuck. Chuck was the first one really to take over leadership at Greyston Bakery from Bernie from 1993 to 2003, and for the last 10 years, Chuck has been the president of Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. So, Chuck, if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself, I will do the reverse and let you take over.
Thanks, Jeff, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm in a hotel room in New York, so this is about as good a background as I could come up with, and apologies for that. It's really a pleasure to be with a group of Zen peacemakers. This is continues to be a really important Dharma organization, and I was really pleased to be invited to join you all. Let me start, by just painting a little bit of a picture. Bernie, the entrepreneur, I wasn't quite sure how to approach this, but as many of you know, entrepreneurship in the Zen community of New York began when the community was living in Riverdale in the residence called Greyston, and started the bakery in Riverdale as a way of creating a livelihood for Zen students. And that was really a very kind of centuries and centuries familiar to spiritual communities, whether it was monks that were brewing beer or making honey or agricultural products or whatever it was. Dharma communities found ways of kind of creating their own livelihood. But it was really a couple of very significant moments in time, I think, that kind of allowed Bernie to flower as entrepreneur in the way that we look at it today. One was the invitation that he got, which is not mentioned in the Jane Pauley piece, the invitation he got from the quite Republican, quite right of center politically mayor of Yonkers, an old Italian family man named Angelo Martinelli, who Bernie met and in Bernie's style was able to seduce into becoming an ally and an advocate. and invited Bernie to consider the possibility of coming to Yonkers, just north of Riverdale, and probably about as far away from the wealth and privilege of Riverdale as you could get. And so moving up the river a few miles to a burned out lasagna factory, which is the story, the Greyston Bakery moved from being primarily a livelihood for the Zen community into something which, as you saw in the note in the piece, created jobs for people that were either experiencing homeless close to it, or people that were coming out of the prison system as well. And so it was really a shift, I think, in the work that he did. And there's others on this call that are far more able than I am to talk about the impact of that shift to the Zen community of New York, and that's worth a conversation in its own. There were some people, many people, that were incredibly supportive of the evolution of the Zen community, and there were others that felt they wanted a more traditional spiritual home, and that this wasn't the path that they were especially looking to follow. And there's no blame either way here, but I think it is an important part of the conversation. The work with nonprofit entrepreneurship in those days, in the late 80s and 90s, was for the most part limited to what we're all probably familiar with, the kind of work that the Goodwills and the Salvation Armies did, which was a way of basically making some money in order to meet their charitable mission. In some cases, they hired some folks from the community that they worked in, but for the most part, it was not a job creation. And it was certainly not a life transforming initiative that these larger institutions had. And there's certainly, I mean, they're noble endeavors, so there was nothing wrong with it. But Bernie had a far greater sense of what he was looking for in terms of working with the people that actually came through the Greyston door. If jobs were being created for people that were struggling, it was more in the style of the sort of sheltered workshop that so many of us are familiar with, where it was basically a view that that was the only place people would be able to put some time into learning a craft, but the notion of moving on was not really on the table. In the case of Greyston, while our view from the beginning was we wanted people to stay and rise up through the ranks as much as possible, the reality was we also knew that we needed to pay attention to how to help people exit, where their path brought them to Greyston, but their path also took them away from Greyston. And the question was going to be, could we actually help them land someplace that was going to continue their journey? And I think that that was really an important part of the work. I arrived at Greyston, and I knew Bernie, I should say this, I knew Bernie because he was a member of the Naropa Board of Trustees, as was I in those early days. And we had conversations 3 times a year at Naropa board meetings. So they lasted about an hour and a half, 3 times a year. And he kept pushing me to consider moving to New York. And I resisted for a while, but as many of you on this call know, at some point I surrendered. And my wife, Judy, and I decided that moving to New York and taking on this challenge was something that we were really interested in doing. And I initially arrived to work on Greyston Health Services, which was the HIV/AIDS housing and health center that we opened. But I guess maybe because of my particular style also as an entrepreneur, after about 6 months, I had a meeting with Bernie, and we did it at a diner in downtown Yonkers. And if you go with Bernie to breakfast, in those days anyway, he got his food in front of him before the waitress ever took somebody else's order, because they knew exactly what he wanted. It was already on the plate before we sat down. And I said to him, you know, I'm happy to keep doing this health services work because it's really the reason I came. But, you know, there's really nobody home in terms of organizing the overall work that we were doing with the bakery, with housing, with childcare, and many other things. Not that there weren't really incredibly important people, a lot of whom were students of Bernie's, doing the work, but he had a integrated vision. And I think that integrated vision resonated with me. My tradition is Tibetan Buddhism. He talked a lot about the 5 Buddha families and about mandala principle, both of which are really important in my own Buddhist tradition. And that was those are messages of integration. And it felt like we still at Greyston had silos that we were working within. And so I suggested that maybe we not slow things down, because no one ever had a conversation with Bernie about slowing things down that got anywhere, but that we took a step back enough to be able to consider whether or not there was a different structure that we could look at. And that was really the birth of the Greyston Foundation, which became the overall umbrella, if you will, organization, nonprofit that owned the bakery, which it was was a for-profit entity, and the housing and healthcare and other services as well. And that's actually what we worked on in the early 90s for quite a while, and put some boards together. Some board members are on this call now, Paco being one of the most stalwart. We'll hear from him in a minute as well. And so that was the work that we did. And we had the view that we were perfectly comfortable looking at bringing in a balance of earned income and philanthropic support, that there was nothing wrong with philanthropy, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with coming at the work we were doing with a profit motive. And so that, I think, was very important. We saw a brief snippet of Ben Cohn on the Jane Pauley piece. 1987 was really a turning point, I think, in Bernie's evolution as an entrepreneur. And so in 1987, Naropa actually co-sponsored an event up in the mountains at Gold Lake, Colorado, which became the Social Venture Network, which is a whole other story. Bernie was there with Ram Dass as spiritual advisors and anchors to this group of wealthy young people who wanted to look at a different way of using their wealth to support community development work. But Bernie arrived as this spiritual teacher, and after a walk around the lake with Ben Cohn, which is kind of this iconic moment, he left as a business partner of Ben and Jerry's, and arrived back in Yonkers with the good news, and I put in quotes, that Greyston had an opportunity to make these brownies for Ben and Jerry's, which turned out to be a 3-year journey into the depths of brownie hell before Greyston was able to rise back up and figure out actually how to produce these brownies that would go into the ice cream and be shipped around the world, actually, and which to this day is still the case and very important. But it really was a transformative moment, I think, for Bernie, when he really understood that he could leverage his entrepreneurial vision into into business in a really large scale. And I know I just have a couple of more minutes, so there's so much more that we can talk about. But let me do one thing before I forget, which is also to note that the reason Bernie the entrepreneur was successful was because of the women that Bernie was partnered with. Whether it was Helen initially when the Greyston Bakery started in Riverdale, and absolutely Jishu, who was his partner the entire time, was my partner on the business side of things, and who brought a perspective that was essential, I think, to the ways in which we looked at how to integrate personal transformation along with community development and community growth. That didn't always work that well. We were working not with people that came together because of their spiritual connection to each other, but working with people who came from completely different spiritual traditions, if they had any at all. And it was a lot of work, not always successful, in trying to figure out how to bring the concepts of what today we would call mindfulness practice or compassion practice into communities that didn't really have that tradition, but who were thirsting for some kind of spiritual connection, and in some very sweet ways looked to Bernie as a spiritual teacher, even though they had really no real sense of what his spiritual tradition was all about. It was Bernie as the individual, Jishu as the individual, who provided a kind of care and support that was very familiar to people that had any connection with their own churches, and for whom no one was left out. And that was incredibly important. So the last thing I would say is, I think that when the histories are written about where social entrepreneurship has gone since Greyston, I think the things that we'll find is Right now, you can look up open hiring, which is the basis of the bakery's hiring process, which is that anybody that wants a job gets a job when one opens up if they're on the list. And that is now something where there are centers for studying open hiring, including one that the UN put together. That really began at Greyston. The B Corps, or benefit corporations, which is now an international movement, and Greyston Bakery was the first B Corp in New York State, really emerged because there was a demonstration that mission and profit could go together in a single entity. And that work was happening at Greyston when virtually nobody else was having those conversations. And so those are very important as well. And then I think scaling these businesses, the last thing I'll say, has been something which we were able to begin work at Greyston that then scaled into something really significant. And the most dramatic, maybe I would say, or the most notable in my mind, is we were one of the 4 nonprofits that started an HMO for homeless people living with AIDS, a kind of absurd idea that anybody could find a way to create a sustainable HMO like that, which today, called AmitaCare, is an $850 million HMO. I, for the last 2 years before I moved back to Boulder, was the interim CEO, which was quite the challenge of AmitaCare, but brought with me the fact that we were able to use Medicaid money to do things like meditation practice, yoga practice, and other contemplative practices. And the only reason I was able to even have the nerve to do that was really watching how those practices impacted the people that we worked with in Yonkers for the 10 years I was there. So I had nothing but gratitude for Bernie for convincing me to make the move. It was a complicated personal relationship. I loved him greatly, but not without its bumps. But it was really the blessing of my professional career, for sure, to be able to do this work. So I will stop and turn it back over to the moderator. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. Wonderful sharing. We really appreciate this. And let's keep moving through our guest. Norman Fischer is with us. And Norman, if you want to go ahead and unmute, I'll hand you the microphone. Thanks for being here, Norman.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Well, I'm going to give a report from a foot soldier working in the trenches in the bakery when the bakery first started in the early 1980s. I had been, a student at the San Francisco Zen Center for a long time, was an ordained priest, and my family and I moved. Bernie came out, I think, to California and invited us, and we were happy to move to New York to be with the Zen community. It was a year long. We were going to be there. I think Bernie hoped that we would stay longer, and I was enjoying myself. I was up for staying longer. I'm originally from the East Coast, but my wife is from California, so she happened to be that winter. It was really cold, and she said, "No, we can't live in a place where it gets to be 0 degrees. Nobody can live in a place where it gets to be 0 degrees. We must return to California." So we were only there for a year. We had 2 children and moved everybody back home at the end of the year. But during that year, the bakery was just getting underway, and it was really quite something. It's a good thing we were all young, I'll tell you, because we would get up in the morning and sit, and then we would put on our baker's whites, and we would be carted into a white van without seats in it, probably completely illegal to put us all inside this closed van without seats in it. And we would drive from Riverdale, where we lived in a fabulous mansion, not very well kept up, but nevertheless a fabulous mansion, and went to Yonkers, which, as we heard, was kind of a funky place just a few miles away, where we would be unloaded from the van and go into the bakery. And we were trying to learn how to bake. Nobody knew really how to bake. We were trying to learn how to bake while we were at the same time filling vast orders for huge amounts of pastries, mostly pastries, you know. And I remember so many times when, like one time that sticks in my mind was when we, at great cost of time and effort, figured out how to fill this one order of things that we didn't really know how to bake. And then, you know, big bakery trays with stacks of trays wheeled on a cart, and the cart hit a bump in the floor and everything fell out and smashed, and we had to bake it all over again. And we were there that night till about 10 or 11 o'clock after having started it, maybe 7 o'clock in the morning. And then there was the most delightful Japanese guy who was the foreman, Kosho. I don't know where Kosho is now. He's the greatest person. He was completely, let's just keep going no matter what. And so at the end of the day, no matter what, how exhausted we were, he would always say, okay, time to clean. And he loved to clean. I think actually his dad was one of the founders of a Japanese religion, a new religion, and cleaning was their main practice. I think they would knock on people's doors and say, hi, can we clean your bathroom? And people would say, really? And they'd say, yeah, and they'd go in and clean people's bathrooms. Well, that was Kosho's dad, and Kosho had that same spirit. Time to clean, and we would clean the entire bakery up and down and get home really late and get up the next morning to sit. I don't know how we did that. And then when we had a day off, we would all go into Manhattan where we would sample, you know, we would do samples in grocery stores. That's what we did on our days off, and then start the next week. Well, then somehow Bernie figured out that we could do bread on a massive scale, that we could sell bread all over Manhattan. And he had us baking bread, huge quantities of bread. We finally learned how to do it. And but here's the thing about the bread business. You can't sell bread that's not fresh, right? That's the thing, especially when you have, you know, a top of the line bakery that is doing, you know, handmade bread. The whole idea is that it's fresh. Well, think about it. That means that every day you deliver, let's say 50 loaves of bread here and 30 loaves of bread there. You're driving all over Manhattan delivering 20, 30, 50 loaves of bread. Well, if all those loaves of bread don't sell by the end of the day, they're, so to speak, toast. You have to pick them up at the end of the day and bring them back, and they're no good anymore. This is not a good business model, right? Because that means that you are taking enormous losses. So Bernie was undaunted, you know. I'm sorry, that's probably a junk call. Anyway, Bernie was completely undaunted by this. This did not bother Bernie at all. He would say, okay, let's just keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. And every day we would send out, I'm making up a number. Every day we would send out 5,000 loaves of bread. And at the end of the day, 4,500 loaves of bread would come back, right? Something like that. So we were losing a huge amount of money, working really, really hard. And you know, the idea was eventually that this would catch on, and eventually we'd get the right number, exactly the right number, and we wouldn't have so much losses. But it kept on and on and on and on. And I remember there was this kind of feeling like, oh my God, you know, the ship is sinking. How long can we keep this up, and losing this much money? And but like I say, Bernie, who was working side by side with us the whole time, going also on the weekends to sample things in grocery stores in Manhattan, he did not know the idea about giving up, you know. So we just kept going. And I actually don't know what happened after that, because we went back to California, and that's when I think the whole bakery went through a vast transformation. A lot of the stuff that Chuck was talking about, I think, happened after we left, because when we were there, it was all about creating a bakery to support the Zen students. We didn't have anybody else that we were hiring. I think after that, I think Bernie went through all kinds of other transformations to make it work. But I just that's a little sketch of what it was like working there on the ground, right in the beginning of the bakery. It was actually great fun. We would go to Dokusan in the middle of the bakery day. You know, you'd be baking, and all of a sudden somebody would say, "Come to Dokusan," and you go up to Bernie's office in your white bakery outfit and answer a koan or two, and then go back down and keep baking. So it was a wonderful, crazy life, very intense, and amazing. Really could never happen again, probably, but that's what happened then. Thanks for inviting me. It's really great to be in this community, be part of it. And Bernie, as we all know, is a phenomenon, more than merely human. So thanks, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you, Norman. Really appreciate you being here and sharing your recollections. Let us move next. Paco, if you're ready to take the microphone, let's Paco Lugoviña will share with us here.
Yeah, it's so good to see Norman and to see Chuck. In the late '90s, I was trying to get a hold of Bernie, couldn't do it, and finally I caught up with him as he was marketing his book, Instructions to the Cook. And I met him in Omega, approached him, had lunch with him. By the following Monday, I was visiting Greyston. He was still in his office. He had not left. He took me to lunch at Denny's restaurant up in Executive Boulevard, up on Broadway, where it used to be one of his favorite places. Out of that meeting, I came out on a priest path, and being a member of his board, which he asked me to be a member of the board, which Ken used to be the chairperson. And so I stayed there while Bernie was going through transition. Ultimately, he decided that he wanted to leave town for many, many reasons. I think at that point, Chuck had been installed. He asked me if I would continue a Zen practice. And Sally Kitty and I created the Hudson River Zen Peacemaker Center in Yonkers, and used the what used to be the church for the nuns. There was an area where they did their sitting, and we took that over and we created the Hudson River Peacemaker Center in '98, and continuous our practice there until almost COVID was the time that it ended. Bernie asked me to be on the board of Greyston. My recollection might be totally faulty, and Chuck was a young man. But when I met with Chuck, I don't think Chuck was so happy that I was going to get on the board for whatever his reasons. But I think we made some agreement that we would test it out and see how it worked. And I think it worked because I was on the board for 18 years until about 5 years ago. I had a lot of things in common with Chuck. Chuck came at it as a person who had tremendous organizing experience, like I did, and particularly in the South, where I cut my teeth with an organization that was doing work in the late 60s and 70s. And Chuck similarly did work with, I think, was electing the first mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, and then having some other political things in Chicago, which I also had in Chicago. So we had something in common from an earlier days when we were much younger. I did a lot of work with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers in New York through an organization that I created. Bernie was a phenomenon. Bernie and I clashed a lot. But Bernie was able to inspire me to continue, because I came to the party as an entrepreneur. I had been in business in the South Bronx since 1968. And so I knew the business side of things. And I also knew that I wanted to help organizations, particularly CBO, community-based organizations, get into getting off the largest of corporations, foundations, city and government founding, and create their own businesses. So when I met Bernie, that was like a found blessing for me. And being on the board with Chuck, who was also a major entrepreneur, and Chuck talked about a little bit about SNP. I mean, that was a major piece of work, considering that a not-for-profit would go into an HMO and an insurance, unheard of. And most of the people who went into it failed miserably. And as Chuck said, this one that he helped create has continued to this day. Bernie went to the South Bronx because I was working mostly with Christian organizations. I was working with the Latino Pastoral Action Center. He was inspirational, he and Jishu, because Jishu became my teacher. Bernie was not my teacher. Bernie became my teacher when Jishu died, soon after they left Greyston in Santa Fe. But they came to the South Bronx, met Reverend Ray Rivera, who ultimately even traveled to Auschwitz. And he and Jishu left their mark there because Bernie was always creating all these forums. And he created something called the Zen Peacemaker Villages, which had a short life, but one of the places that he went to was the Latino Pastoral Action Center, that to this day sort of considered themselves a peacemaker village, and has continued in the track of entrepreneurship. It is through that I became involved about 25 years ago with charter schools, and charter schools being looked at as a form of the Bernie flavor of entrepreneurship in the communities, because it was a form of decentralization where we had control of the schools, although we continue to be a public school, meaning that we controlled the budgets, we had the hiring, and we also controlled the educational curriculum of the kids, which are by and large, in most cases, Black and brown kids. And so, the rest of it is I just hung out with Bernie. I went to India with Bernie. I went to Sri Lanka with Bernie. I went to Rwanda with Bernie, to Colombia, South America. And so hanging with him was really a pleasure for me. I'm going to stop right now because I know there's a lot of people that really need to speak. But I'm going to end by saying that Ken Byalin, who shaved my head when I became a priest, continue the work, and he'll talk probably about that, because the work of the charter schools that I did earlier, I sort of kind of slightly passed it on to Ken, and Ken took it to a much, much higher level. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you. And like Chuck says, in Europa, you bow. Thank you.
Thank you, Paco. Thank you, Paco. And you mentioned Ken Byalin. Ken, let's hand you the microphone here and go ahead and unmute and please share.
Hear me?
Yes, we hear you well, Ken. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I didn't prepare anything. I knew that getting to go last was a privilege in this situation, and I could get to be inspired by what others shared. When I think I arrived at ZCNY sort of at the the opposite end of this continuum from when Norman was there. Norman described it being the bakery being all Zen students and no one from the community kind of thing. By the time I got there, there were no Zen students involved in the bakery that I knew of, other than really Jishu. They were my teachers. I used to be annoyed, Chuck, of how come, other than Jishu, Bernie relied most closely on Trunkpa students rather than his own students. What was that about? Was where did I miss the boat kind of thing? I got the wrong teacher. I didn't know what was going on. But Bernie had this idea, which Chuck referenced, of this mandala, and I was drawn to it. I came to Zen as a social action person, and I found Zen in my life trying to avoid burnout, and it helped, I must say. But Bernie was the first one who said you could have a spiritual practice and a commitment to justice and peace and social action weren't opposites. He had this vision of the mandala, which became Greyston. Part of my experience was that the mandala really didn't exist anywhere except in Bernie's head. And he held all these components, and he was engaged in all of the components. And despite Chuck's administrative skills, my experience was that the components remained largely in silos. So even when I was the chairman of the ZCNY board, just before Bernie and Jishu left, and when we sold, at that time the ZCNY still owned the bakery, technically, and as they were leaving town, we sold the bakery. ZCNY sold the bakery to Greyston. But I didn't see much, other than I think having a tour of the bakery and helping to paint the childcare center, because that was Jishu's passion. So all of her students got down there one Saturday to paint it so it could open. But Bernie's practice, nevertheless, was inspirational to me. And when I had an opportunity to retire in 2000, I flew out to La Honda, where Bernie was then living, asking him for advice. And of course, Bernie gave me no advice. But when I got back on the plane to fly back to New York, I knew I was going to take the early retirement, and I was going to find out where this peacemaker path would take me. Shortly after that, I was sitting in Paco's office in the South Bronx with no idea where to go. And we did this creative planning thing, which I didn't know what it was at the time. And we put little pieces of yellow paper all over the walls, which was supposed to give me direction. And maybe it did, right? But I knew I wanted to do something. I was inspired by Bernie. I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do. On very concrete levels, I wanted to emulate him. So an early step from that 100-foot pole was to try, in Bernie's words, to bring to the societal table those who have been excluded. Where I found my heart going and my passion was people who were living with major mental illnesses, most of whom had spent much of their lives in psychiatric hospitals. How do we bring them to the table? And we created something that we called the Verrazano Foundation. And you know, why is the name, why is the in the name? So the is in the name because Bernie called his vehicle the Greyston Foundation. So I didn't know what I was doing. Got convinced Paco to be on the board. And then Paco showed up at a meeting, inspired by his work with charter schools in the South Bronx, and said we should do a charter school. And the truth is that I didn't want to really do a charter school, but Paco said we could get a $50,000 planning grant. And maybe the biggest grant we'd gotten up till then was maybe 10,000. So I was a smart ass. So I said, yeah, that's terrific. We'll go for this. I figure we get this planning grant, which could help us do this work that we were doing with people in recovery. And at the end of 2 years, we could go back to the people who gave us the grant and say, look, we did a major feasibility study on doing a school which would level the playing field for kids living with mental illnesses, and we concluded it couldn't be done. I was going to trick them. We did eventually get the planning grant. But we ended up opening our first charter school. And in the beginning, Chucky reminded me of this. In the beginning, I was very much into finding this balance between philanthropy and earned revenue to support the enterprise. But actually the schools grew so rapidly over the next 10, 12 years, that my ability anyway, you know, which was certainly not Bernie's ability to raise money, couldn't keep up with the significance. It was almost impossible for, on a fundraising level, for us to make it, just to make a difference. I think the biggest grant I ever got was from an individual, not from a government source. There's government money out there, but from the individual, I think the biggest grant I ever got was $250,000 over 5 years, which would have boggled my mind 12 years ago when we started, or when the $50,000 planning grant was, whoa, you know. But by the time I retired again last June, the budget at the schools, this network of schools that we ended up creating, the annual revenue was $45 million. And that the amount of energy it took to raise $50,000 when we were running a $45 million business was hard to justify. But it was, all of it was inspired by Bernie. All of it was about using the ingredients Uh, you know, he says that. But it's hard to believe that he meant it, you know? You're just not complaining about the ingredients that you have, using the ingredients that you have. You know, and often that took us in directions that we didn't intend to go. We had all kinds of clever ideas, made all kinds of plans on paper. And this is really this is to me, this is like the takeaway from Bernie the entrepreneur. You know, is that Bernie would make plans. Bernie never got seduced by his plans. He never thought that his plans now had to be followed, that he had to make them work. You know, you make a plan, and then you see what the universe has to say about your plan, and what ingredients, you know, what is the universe like? I think he closed the construction company, right? Worked for a while, then didn't work. He was never like a construction company guy. He was just getting it done. And I guess the Bernie anecdote that I'll close with, share, I guess, captured Bernie. There was a time, oh, it must have been in the mid '90s for a while. There was a flurry of excitement that Richard Gere, the actor, and Bernie hooked up, and for a short period of time, they were going to collaborate on bringing peace to the Middle East. A modest idea, but Gere had great hopes for the partnership. He described it. He said to Bernie that what I have is, what did he say? I have money and publicity karma, which he surely did in those days. That if he wanted press coverage, he had press coverage. He said, I have money and publicity karma, and you have get it done karma. And that was Bernie to me.
Goeie deurgestrigen. Oh nee.
And that was like the inspiration. Look at what's in front of you, see what needs to be done, and get it done.
Thank you, Ken. Much appreciated. Much appreciated. I just wanted to make one comment, and then we'll take some questions, perhaps until about a quarter after the hour. But the comment I wanted to make was this is especially timely and appreciated to hear from our guest speakers who have such a connection with the history of moving into action, really our third tenet. Particularly because on the call today we have more than a few students who are part of the first cohort of Zen Peacemaker Order training. Our first cohort is into their second year now, and we've got 4 or 5, maybe 6 people here who are part of that cohort. And by the way, we're launching our second cohort tomorrow, so it's quite successful so far. Anyway, my point being, what this current group of students is focusing on right now is taking vow into the community, taking vow into action. and doing a project, endeavoring to step out and have an impact and help ease suffering. So this could not be more timely. So once again, I really appreciate your wonderful sharing. I can't see everyone. There are more than will fit on a screen. So if you'll notice the bottom, depending on what you're using, at the bottom of your screen or somewhere, you'll see reactions, and you can raise an electronic hand that I will see. It'll move you to the top of my queue. So if you have, and if we can keep our questions and comments brief, we'll try to accommodate a number of people here in the next 15 minutes or so. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand and I will call on you and you can unmute. And it could be general or it could be for any one of the speakers. Gail, hi. Speaking of someone who's in our first cohort.
Hello. This is really an incredible experience to hear you all. And I wanted to ask a question about how you help people integrate philanthropy and earning income. I'll never forget when it's probably about, I don't know, 20 years ago, I was doing a radio show with a nonprofit community radio in Portland, Oregon, KBOO. And my partner and I got to the point where we wanted to start producing tapes of our shows. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could hire someone, and we would need to sell our tapes in order to do that. And the atmosphere at the radio show, at the radio community, was so against earned income that it was not even safe to bring up the topic of generating income so that we could hire someone to help us with making tapes. So I'm just curious how you communicate about integrating, business and these nonprofit missions. So thank you.
Thanks, Gail. And if one of the four of you, I hesitate to presume to call on you to answer the question, but if one of the four of you is inspired to speak to Gail's question, that would be great.
I'll jump in first.
Thanks.
I think what Bernie's teaching is that making that kind of distinction that you're making to begin with is a trap. That it's, and I came caught up in the trap. That I came with the bias that doing good was what I wanted to do. Making money was bad. So if you were selling something that was making money, you were obviously doing evil. You were a bad person. You were a capitalist. Things like that. And what I think Bernie showed me was you start just doing something. You want to help, so you start by helping. And generally, when you start doing that, you use your own resources. And if the work is working, then you need more resources, and you start to ask other people to help you with money, with labor, with whatever they got. But you ask your friends, and if it takes off at all, you get to a place where you and your friends are doing as much as you can. You need more. And then the question is just what's the best way to get the resources that you need to provide more service. And sometimes the answer is philanthropy. Ask people to give to support this cause. That in some ways can be the easiest, at least to get a little bit of money. Other times, like you find out if there's a way to turn this into a business. And you can see this, in the description of the bakery. And the difference, I think Chuck was talking about, like the difference between the bakery and the Salvation Army, the Greyston Bakery and the Salvation Army, is that what looks like the product being cakes. It's not the product. It's a byproduct of creating livelihood for people who don't have livelihood. And the beauty of it was in that moment, couldn't do something as good as a charity as you could do it as a business. And then what we ended up doing with our schools is neither a for-profit business nor a charity in a traditional sense. Charter schools are privately operated, not for profit corporations. And at least in certain parts of the country, are able to provide mechanisms for doing all kinds of stuff. But the mechanism itself is not the purpose. Charter schools are not the purpose. Bakeries are not the purpose. To me, the words, bringing to the societal table those who have been excluded, that's the purpose. You just do, you use the ingredients at hand. If you can, don't try, you can't force it, but the ingredients are always there.
Thank you, Ken. Gail, I hope that helps you a little bit with your question.
Maybe
Totally.
let me just add two things maybe to Gail's question, which I think is important. One is, in today's world, venture philanthropy is an entire aspect of the sort of philanthropic world, and that had a lot to do with the fact that as wealth started being transmitted to a new generation, there was a new generation that actually wasn't particularly resistant to the combination of earned income and philanthropy inside of a mission-driven organization. The challenge has been was the mission sort of the lipstick, and that really the profit motive was key. And I think what we found, even though there was no venture philanthropy was not really a thing in the 90s as it is today, we found that meeting people at Greyston, whether it was the employees or whether it was Bernie, there was no doubt that mission was leading, and that the profit that was saying, we're not afraid of capital, we're actually fine transmuting whatever capital brings along with it into something which is good, but that you had to be honest in terms of being able to show the mission. And that was not always the case in other organizations that claimed to have that perspective but didn't always deliver.
Thank you, Chuck. Great addition. We have just a few more minutes here. Perhaps we can take another question or two. Somebody would like to raise your Electronic hand.
Jeff, I would love to hear from Chris, who is also an entrepreneur and who had such a huge experience and influence in the early years of the Greyston endeavor. So, love to hear a few hum tunes from our chairman.
Chris, go ahead. You've been tagged.
Yeah, thanks, Paco. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris. I'm currently the board chair serving for ZPI. It's really heartwarming to hear all these stories about Bernie and to see him live on video. You know, for me, it's really about what do we take forward? You know, what can we learn and take forward? And, you know, I was blown away when I came to New York. I moved to New York from Chicago in the early 90s. And what I really took away was what is a completely full expression of your practice in the world. I was just blown away by Bernie's courage, by the risk he was willing to take, and by his acumen. You know, this was no joke. There were a lot of skills required. And I was really surprised to see, and it was eye-opening, I was a little naive, that really in order to be helpful, to be meaningfully helpful, it may be hard on you. You may suffer. It also struck me that in order to be helpful, you know, good intentions only go so far. You really have to try hard. You have to use the best of everything you have to really be helpful. So that's what I took away in the early days. And that's what I still try to take forward. There may be better questions.
Thank you, Chris. We have a few more minutes if someone else has something to share or a question to ask or a comment you would like to make.
Jeff, you have a lot of interesting people in this audience, and one of the people who were very significant in terms of her work is Jennifer Dorn, who was, in fact, Bernie in my first meeting did not show up because Jennifer's husband had an accident in South Africa, and he had forgotten that he had a eulogy to make at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And just a word from her, some of the work that she does, which is perhaps not in the area of entrepreneur, but who knows, maybe it is.
Jennifer, don't feel like you have to speak. Paco's reaching out, and I'll let you raise your hand if you'd like to, or go ahead and unmute.
Well, I think, I know Paco, Chris and I are in the same place of thanks, Paco. Done out of love, I know, so here I am answering. You know, I do love seeing all the footage, and I love hearing it all again. And it also raises for me what was great, and also all the contradictions that don't get solved. You know, issue of racism, this whole project dedicated to the right things, right? And there we've talked about it many times. There we sit in Greystone, and we're in the middle of a Black and Latinx community, and the majority of people, Paco excluded, are white. You know, where it's the big struggle that I feel many of us are taking seriously in CPI. You know, and what's sustainable? That's the other thing. I'm involved in building midwifery and nursing programs, helping people build them, mostly in African and global South countries. What's sustainable? What goes when you're not there? I think, Ken, you raised that beautifully. You know, what happens after? And it's right to dream big, and it's also right to make promise no easy victories. Bernie certainly never did. I'm an optimist. He's an optimist. Most of us here try to be, but it's you do the best you can building a model. I had a model of a childbearing center in the South Bronx that served women for 20 years, women who to this day continue to die at 3 times the rate of white women in this country, let alone global rates. And it ended, but there were lessons in it that are critical to take out and pass on to all this next generation of activists and fighter for equity. So I feel like that's the joy I get in this discussion and thinking, is not that there were solutions so much, for a lot of creative things happened, and there was change, and what do we learn from it, and how do we pass that on, and how do we keep building. I'm now asked by the Bronx Borough President, Vanessa Gibbons, who's determined to have a new birthing center in the South Bronx, and because the rates are even higher for death based on racism. So, you keep doing it. And that's always what Bernie was about. He was always about encouraging you, keep doing it. You're never afraid to try. But don't promise any easy victories to people. People face hard decisions. I thought last week, when I heard the whole thing with the homelessness and the retreats, part of what, and I thought Enkyo addressed it beautifully, part of what was confusing or sat with me was, don't romanticize going on the streets to find your own liberation. People are desperate. No mother with her kids wants to live on the street. No, I mean, this is not, if anything, you take down the veil that there's a difference between that woman and her kids and me and my kids or grandkids. Look, you take that down, but let's be realistic too. Maybe it'll increase your compassion and understanding, but it's not for our liberation. It's really to say, go out and do more, in my opinion, as an activist to work on ending homelessness or all of the inequities. So there's a piece about who we are, and I look at me, and I'm always trying to push myself harder. And the beauty of having this time for Roshi Bernie is, is such great love for this person, how he changed my life. He came into my life, in my late husband's life. It was definite force that brought him in, he and Jishu, to then help me go through Haywood's death and find how we kept on being as engaged as ever. I consider him, my life is fundamentally changed forever by him and by my Zen practice and by many of you here. So I guess I'm saying many different things, but there's a lot of big issues in there. Unfortunately, we live in a time of incredibly catastrophic racism and inequity. So our task only grows more urgent. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for sharing. And we're running short on time here. Roger, you've had your hand up for a while. If you'd like to go ahead, and perhaps you'll be our last question here.
Oh, pardon me. I didn't necessarily have a question. I wanted to express how grateful I am for the last 2 weeks of hearing from people so central to the work that Zen Peacemakers has done. I'm brand new to Zen Peacemakers, but not to Zen, but I'm very, very grateful because I'm now retired in Oaxaca, Mexico, and I was really tuned to what I think Ken was talking about with charter schools. I was very, very attentive to that. And I just wanted to express how grateful I am to have found what Chris had said, which was I was searching for a long time as to the full expression of my mission within the practice. And that's why I've come here. I'm very grateful for what I've heard and been a part of. And I really look forward to more of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taigyo. Really appreciate that. And with that, we will thank everyone for attending. I do want to once again remind us all, we will meet again next Friday at the same time. And for our third session in this 4-part series as a memorial to Bernie Glassman. And next week we'll focus on interfaith. And we learned, Chris, I believe I can say this, we learned just this morning that our guests next week will include Krishna Das and Roshi Wendy Gyoku Nikau from the Zen Center of Los Angeles, and Rabbi David Curio, among others. Perhaps, Chris, I don't know if we can say more than that at this point.
Father Kennedy will be there.
Sorry?
Father Kennedy.
And Father Kennedy is confirmed as well. So do join us next week. It'll be really rich and wonderful. I especially want to thank Chuck Lief and Norman Fischer and Paco and Roshi Ken Byalin for being our guest speakers today. And I wish everybody a safe and healthy Friday and a wonderful weekend. Take care of yourselves. Thank you so much for being here.